Hi class, welcome to another lesson in Introduction to the Middle East. Today we're going to be talking about the second half of our Egypt lesson. We're going to go from 1952 to the present. And we want to begin with World War II. We'll start there. And as you read in Brother Peck's book, this time the Suez Canal was almost lost to the German armies, the famous Afrika Corps of Panzer tanks commanded by General Rommel. And Rommel was expelled from North Africa. If you read there on the left there, it says Rommel pushed across North Africa deep into Egypt, where his army was stopped at El Amin with U.S. forces pushing toward Rommel from the west, and Montgomery pushing from the east in immediate danger to the canal was stopped, and Nazis were shortly thereafter expelled from North Africa. Thank goodness. Thanks for General Montgomery and General George Patton. Well, Egypt became a giant army camp for British, Canadian, Indian, Australian, New Zealand, South African, and even U.S. troops. In fact, Egypt to this day still suffers from World War II. Let me show you in what way they do. In the same area that I just showed you in El Amin, I want to show you what they still need to do there today. Interesting. Even today, they're still suffering, still struggling from a war that was started a long time ago. Well, let's begin. After World War II, let's talk about the prelude to the revolution of 1952. There was a perfect storm brewing. There was an inept king. King Farouk becomes inept because, let me back up. He becomes inept because he basically, for a lot of reasons, but he mortifies the Egyptians by his womanizing, his gambling, his gluttony. But there's also a corrupt political party. The Wafd becomes corrupt. They lost credibility as the standard bearer of Egyptian nationalism. They agreed to form a government backed by the British tanks in 1942, and then Makram Ubaid's Black Book, it exposes the leader's corruption, and then there's decrepit parliament, and then the living conditions, the poor living conditions were bad. In fact, when my wife and I were there back in 1996, the water in our hotel room was dirty. It was we filled up the bathtub, and it was brown. And now, this is in 1996. Imagine what it was like in the 1950s, and so people are struggling with a contaminated Nile, even to this day. And then there's the city of the dead. I don't know for how many hundreds of years people have been. I'm assuming for a long, long time people have been buried there. And because when I saw it, our guide said, as far as you can see is the city of the dead, and there's just graves everywhere. And the people, so many people, the poor people have nowhere to live, and so they go there and they live there in the city of the dead. In fact, they've lived there so long that they have addresses, and the post office delivers mail to them. And these kind of poor living conditions, they, as you know from Hunger Games, it lights the fuse to a revolution. And people become disenchanted with the old, and they become enamored with the new. And basically, I should say, it becomes the powder keg that really explodes the constituents. They become disenchanted, and they want change. And so, yeah, let's talk a little bit about the inept king, King Farouk. Um, King Farouk, here's a picture of him. He reigned as president from 1936 to 1952. He was kind of a tragic figure. His father dies before he finished his schooling. He lacked emotional maturity, political judgment. And after World War II, he became more inept. And as the WAF party became more corrupt, the parliament mutated, and rebellion was just inevitable. By the way, he has a car crash in 1943 that left him with a kind of glandular disturbance, some believe, and he started to become obese, and he had a reputation as a woman chaser, a porn addict. And this is his wife. We've talked about her last time, Queen Farida. She was very beloved by the Egyptians. It will be a difficult marriage. It'll end up in divorce. He spends his nights in cabarets with women, often women that are married to officials, officers. It was said that he stole other people's properties. And he wanted to implement economic and social reform, but the royal family owned 1/10 of arable land, the major source of power in agrarian society like they had. And even if he wanted to give up his land, he would not have been able to persuade the other heirs of Mehmet Ali and Ismail to follow his examples. I just don't think he could have. And all the landowning upper class, they would suffer if they distributed all the land. And so Farouk felt very impotent. In fact, he said once, "Soon there will be only 5 kings left: the king of England, spades, the king of clubs, the king of hearts, the king of diamonds. That's all there will be." And then comes along the 1948 Israel war. Israel declared itself a state. The act enrages Muslims and Arabs throughout the Middle East. In fact, Emir Abdullah of Transjordan, he will come in, he'll attack Palestine, and Farouk will send Egyptians to war also when Israel declares himself a state, because he fears Transjordan's Emir Abdullah will take Palestine first. And so Abdullah was kind of his nemesis. In fact, plus he didn't want to recognize the Hashemite family as the leaders of the Middle East. And at one time they're of the Hashemites. At one time they were over Mecca and Medina, and he doesn't want that to happen again, as well as other Middle East countries as well. And so I had you watch that video and asked, why did the Egyptian army fail to take Israel in the 1948 war? Why was the Egyptian army halted only 20 miles from Tel Aviv? Well, I've heard it said that luck is for the ill-prepared, and the Egyptians were ill-prepared for this war. In fact, they had to borrow road maps of Palestine from Cairo's Buick dealer. They didn't do their homework before they went in and attacked. And one of the officers that would go and fight, his name was Gamal Abdel Nasser, and in his memoirs he wrote that how you win a battle is there's 5 things: you feed the troops, you care for the wounded, you survey enemy territory, you create battle strategies, and you create fallback positions. And none of these were done by the Egyptian army, because it was Farouk's war. It was his political war. He was over it, and he was insistent. He was insistent that he would make a lot of the strategic decisions, and he was confiding in an actress named Lillian Camilla Cohen, and he didn't realize that she was passing his orders over to the Israeli spies. Well, consequently, they will lose the battle. They will lose that war. 2,000 Egyptians would be dead or wounded or missing. And the Egyptian officers, they were so angry at Farouk and his regime. And these men right here, they will call themselves the young officers. And there were many societies starting to plot to overthrow Farouk, but only the free officers, they'll succeed at it. And some think that they actually, so the war was 1948, Some think they actually started doing this in 1942. And they were just basically a cabal of 300 commissioned officers. Most of them were in their 30s. They attended Egyptian military academy. They were educated. They were ambitious young men. They loved their country, and they often came from lower middle class backgrounds. And the young officers, they felt Egypt's welfare depended on destroying all points of the power triangle that we've talked about between the British, the Waft, and King Farouk. And then I had you watch that video where the young officers rise up in the revolution, and I said, who did they blame for losing the 1948 war? And of course it was Farouk. And what did they do to rectify the loss? They rise up, and so they rise up in the 1952 revolution. And they debated whether to kill Farouk or try him or exile him. And finally they agreed to just let him abdicate in favor of his 6-month-old son and to leave Egypt. So he begged the U.S. and British embassies to stop the coup, but both refused. So he'll leave. And remember, I told you his wife, Queen Farida, I don't know if she left right away with him, but she will end up coming back if she did leave. I know she stays in Egypt for many years, moves to Europe, and then I think she comes back. Let's talk a little bit about Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser, he's the one that will make Egypt an independent country. And he was a pure Egyptian, like some of the other Egyptians who had roots elsewhere. So he will become the president. He will become the first Egyptian leader since the pharaoh. His mother's early death wounds him deeply. He resents his father's quick remarriage. Some say he grew moody and introspective, but he excels in his studies. He's very smart. He's a fervent nationalist. He took part in many demonstrations. In fact, he was even shot when he was a teenager. And he tried to enter the military academy, but he was rejected. And so he went to law school. He was finally accepted to the military academy after he passed a very competitive exam. And some said he had a very serious disposition, just always a very wooden face. He was a masterful organizer, tactician. Some say that Nasser's incorruptibility impressed Egyptians and foreigners alike. And the free officers, they had these 6 guiding points that they put together in their little secret society in 1951 before they rose up in the 1952 revolution. And it was simply this: eliminate feudalism, destroy British occupation, end capitalism's domination, establish social equality, form a strong army, and establish democracy. Well, let's talk a little bit about how the revolution matured. There's a challenge in many revolutions, and it is this: how do you transition from resisting the other's authority without imposing your own authority, right? And Nasser, he was the leader of the young colonels. They will eventually call themselves, they'll create what's called the Revolutionary Command Council. It was kind of a watchdog committee that was set up to watch over the government, and they would vote whether Egypt would be ruled by a dictatorship or democracy. So they're trying to decide, should we be a dictatorship or a democracy? And by a 7-1 vote, the RCC, they chose for a dictatorship government, and it incensed Nasser. He storms out of the room. There he goes, out of the room. The officers they feared that if they don't have him, they ruling without him, they wouldn't succeed because he was so charismatic, he was so influential and powerful. So they chased him down. They promised him, we will be a democracy. But what's interesting is that once he took power, he will have no regard for parliamentary democracy. He'll become a dictator. Now, Kermit Roosevelt, CIA agent, he is, some believe that he was part of this. In fact, he will order another agent to take a suitcase of $3 million to one of Nasser's aides. And Nasser is very sensitive about taking bribes. And so he'll use the money to build the Cairo Tower. It has a restaurant, blinking antenna on top. Ironically, Nasser avoids the tower because he believes the CIA is using it to spy on him. Washington wanted Nasser to make an anti-communist pact and make a peace with Israel, but of course he will not do that. Nasser wanted the Americans to pressure the British to leave the Suez Canal, and they won't do that. So they kind of have an impasse. Brother Peck, in his From Mohammed Mubarak book, he said, Nasser knew that Egypt was in need of a deep reforms and modernization. The most pressing need involved agriculture, land, and irrigation. Nasser began negotiating with the United States to secure funding for the construction of a new dam on the Nile, the famous High Dam at Aswan. Now, John Foster Dulles, who's the U.S. Secretary of State, he pressured Nasser to give the U.S. military access to Egypt in exchange for helping secure financing for the High Dam. And of course, Nasser refused. So now, John Foster, he wanted Nasser to leave the other Arab states and Israel alone. So he'll offer this economical assistance, especially a large loan to construct the dam. But what's interesting is, on the other hand, Dulles he'll denounce Nasser's neutralism between communism in the West and his threats against Israel and the recognition of the people of China, the Republic of China. And so it's really interesting there. And here's, you can see right here, if you follow the Nile up, go up there, start heading south, you can see the Aswan High Dam. Here's what it looks like up close. And it became to symbolize Egypt's reawakening. It would hold a whole year's of floodwater. Farmers didn't need to worry about, if the Nile is going to flood too high or too low. They can sow their crops, they can harvest their crops, and it enabled Egyptians to irrigate 1 million more farms, and it produced enough electric power to meet all of Egypt's electric needs. Now, in July 1956, after Egypt decided to accept the Aswan Dam loan offer, Dulles, he wants to humiliate Nasser, so he yanks it out of their hands. It's really interesting. And and so that ticks Nasser off. So he'll basically nationalize the Suez Canal in 1956, and he'll pledge to use its profits, most which had gone to the European investors since it opened in 1869. And he said, when Nasser stood up in a speech, he said to the Americans, "Oh, Americans, may you choke to death in your fury." It was the British and France, though, that would choke, because they were the canal's main users for oil imports. Well, in 1955, he announced he would buy $200 million from Czechoslovakia, weapons from Czechoslovakia, and which was really the USSR he was getting them from. In France, they'll hasten to sell more weapons to Israel because Nasser stirred up these anti-French feelings in Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria. So let's talk about the nationalization of the Suez Canal. He regarded the U.S. response to him as an insult, and that's when he, as I said, he'll nationalize it. And it was the Egyptians, he said, not the French, that would manage and take the tolls to pay for the dam. And his speech, when he announced that, his speech will receive a tumultuous response from the Egyptians, because the canal, it represented the West exploiting Egypt. And to the Arabs and India, Nasser became a huge hero for defying the imperial West.
This is no exaggeration to say that this has been the worst week for the country since 1939.
Nasser triumphantly hoisted the Egyptian flag over the Canal Zone base, this most vital of the world's waterways, and Britain suffers most.
Nasser will be able to close the canal, cut us off from the oil on which we absolutely depend.
There can be no agreed settlement which leaves the canal in the unfettered control of one man or one government.
And the next step, in your view, would be?
Military intervention. It is the correct thing to do, ma'am.
There can be no military action without support from the UN. We cannot go to war alone.
British and French troops are on the move. The world waits tensely to see whether the British flag will fly once more over Suez.
We put our trust in our ruling class. We put this great country in their hands.
Our Prime Minister has had no option but to retreat. Our reputation for integrity in matters of foreign policy has been shattered.
That was from a great little clip from the series The Crown. That was a major crisis for Britain, and that was a difficult pill for them to swallow. Nasser he'll block the canal. And the Suez War was a military defeat for Israel, Britain, and France, but really it was a political triumph for Nasser. He'll lose most of his jet fighters. His army will lose some credibility. But Nasser showed Egyptians would stand up to the British, and he was the foremost foe of imperialism and Zionism. And incidentally, the Muslim Brotherhood would try to assassinate him they'll shoot at him 8 different times. They didn't hit anything but a light bulb. Now, Radio Cairo will beam propaganda into all the other Arab countries, discrediting their leaders or inciting them to overthrow their colonial masters. And they also broadcasted anti-Zionist propaganda toward Israel. So he will become, so the Palestinians who are living in the Holy Land, he'll become a hero to them. They sunk ships in the canal to bar anybody from passing through, and they would refuse to move the sunken ships until the British, France, and Israeli invaders until they left and withdrew. And so the Suez War, it'll weaken British and French influence in the Middle East. It'll raise U.S. prestige a little bit, and it will improve USSR reputation greatly. And then many British, French, and Israeli subjects living in Egypt were expelled without their property. And then Egypt will boycott all French and British products. Now let's talk about, so we get into the 1960s. Let's talk a little bit about Nasser and his move towards socialism. What's called the July Laws of 1961 were some laws passed that would move towards a more socialist regime, a socialist government. And socialism has many meanings, but in Muslim states, it's rarely used in the pure Marxian sense. In Egypt, socialism meant state ownership, and it meant management of the means of production. So most industries would be regulated, income would be redistributed. Egyptians can only make a certain amount of money. They'd get taxed 90% if they made over 23,000. They could only have 100 fedans of land. That was like 1 acre. And so more government regulation, regulation of nationalization of textiles, tobacco, pharmaceuticals, shipping, banks, and and of course land reform, as I mentioned. And many oppose Nasser's policies, and they'll send their money or their children out of Egypt. And then one of the things, Nasser, his 1962 guarantee of government jobs for every university graduate, one of the consequences of that is it will swell the bureaucratic ranks, and so that'll become a challenge later. And then comes the 1967 war. You remember I told you the Muslim Brotherhood tried to assassinate Nasser? But really the biggest menace to Egypt was Israel, at least in 1967. Egypt had more land, soldiers, but it was poorly equipped to resist an Israeli attack. And unfortunately, Nasser overlooked that detail, and he would make his biggest mistake in 1967, well, prior to it, and then into 1967. So what he does is he arouses anxiety in Israelis, because he'll start to, over the radio of Cairo radio, he'll start to announce this propaganda, make this propaganda campaign against Israel, and he'll say things like, "We're going to wipe you out. We're going to push you into the sea." And he said he said to people in the press, "I'll never start a war." But he was saying these things. He was saying things out of one side of the mouth, but then he was saying something out of the other side and doing other things that made Israel believe that that's not true. And one thing that he did that upset Israel and that worried them. But then also Nasser will sponsor Palestinian Fedayeen raids against Israel. Fedayeen just literally means those who sacrifice themselves. So he was sponsoring, paying for terrorism against Israel, these terrorists that were Palestinians that were in Jordan and in Israel. He'll confiscate Israel-bound cargo, and then he'll blockade the Straits of Tiran, which go into the Red Sea, which go up to that port of Israel. And when he stops the oil, that really is pushing Israel. And Goldschmidt, in his book, this is a great book, by the way, called Modern Egypt, kind of gives a good overview of everything that happened. He said, in Egypt, the history of Egypt, he said, the Arabs had made those radio threats not so they would be carried out, but to impress one another. Israel denied it had waged war to expand its territory. It called for peace negotiations and recognition. Above all, it wanted security. It got none. And so, as you know, the Israelis make a preemptive attack on Egypt. And in that video clip I showed you, and I asked what were the consequences, they wiped out Egypt's Air Force, wiped out Jordan's. They cleaned the plate, and it was humiliating to Nasser. In fact, he announced he's going to step down, that he failed as the people's leader, and they were so upset about that they begged him to not step down, and so he doesn't. But he will die a few years later, on September 28th, 1970. And so I was curious, if we were together as a class, I would have asked the question, what is your opinion of Nasser? Did he help or hurt Egypt? And is he a hero? Is he oppressor, revolutionist, nationalist, socialist? There's a famous scene, there's a movie called Nasser 56. And the film was made to commemorate, I'm assuming it was made, it's in Arabic, and I'm assuming it was made in Egypt, but it was made to commemorate the Suez War in 1956. It looks like a 1950s, 60s movie. It's a black and white. I have it somewhere. But in the movie, an old Egyptian woman from Upper Egypt, the region where Nasser's from, she gets a chance to talk to Nasser in private. And she hands him this wretched, flimsy pair of trousers, which used to belong to her grandfather. And she tells Nasser that the man was like millions of Egyptian youths, taken from his village to Al-Sukra. Al-Sukra means slavery, to dig the Suez Canal. And like many of the millions, she said, he never came back. He died young, far away from me, from my home. Why did he die? She says to Nasser. For what? And who brought such a death upon him? To Nasser, to her and millions like her, he avenged the crimes inflicted on the exploited, broken masses. Tariq Osman, in his Nasser's Complex Legacy, he wrote the book Islamism, A History of Political Islam. He also wrote Egypt on the Brink. But he said, since then, generations had passed, yet the Suez Canal, for which her grandfather had died, remained in the hands of foreigners. And so Nasser, nationalizing the Suez Canal, Egypt became the rightful owner, or he became the rightful owner of the pair of trousers. So he, to her, and millions like her, avenged the crimes, and he became a hero.
At the end of September 1970, Gamal Abdel Nasser died of a heart attack. For 16 years, he had led Egypt. His death marked the end of an era. Kulthum received the news in Moscow, where she had gone to perform. She cancelled her concerts and flew home.
ورجعت القاهرة يومها لابسة اسود ونزلت القاهرة تبكي. طبعا احنا كنا كلنا متوقعين انها أصيبت بصدمة عنيفة جدا، لأن عارفين إنها بتحب ناصر قوي. فأنا كنت في المطار وشفتها وهي نازلة من الطيارة وسلمت علينا يعني. وزي ما هي كانت بتحكي لما بتحزن بتنزل تقعد في بدروم البيت، فراحت قعدت في البدروم شوية لغاية
You remember from our last lesson together in Egypt, I showed you that video clip of Kulthum singing. She was the Arabs' world grandest diva. She sang to him in behalf of millions, and she sang a song that, in essence, the title would mean in English, "Stay, you're the hope." And so, yeah, he was very beloved by her and many people. But in that article, same article, Tariq Osman says this: "But this is only one Gamal Abdel Nasser, for there are others. Arab cinema is again the best conveyor of sharply different version. In Al-Karnak, an Egyptian film produced in the mid-1970s, the leading Egyptian actress, Suad Hasni, brilliantly exposed what a broken soul would look like after her character, an inspiring postgraduate student, was humiliated, tortured, and raped in Nasser's prisons." So the same Nasser is, for millions of onlookers, he's the man that single-handedly crushed Egypt's budding democracy through his dictatorship. He inculcated fear into the people and fear into the masses. People in that camp, in this camp that didn't like him, they invoke his legacy as the prime cause of many Egyptians' ills today. So Osman, in his article, he said, between the two Nassers, no objective version emerges. So he said, really, there's 5 Nassers. There's the hero Nasser, the oppressor, the revolutionist, the civic Arab nationalist, and then the socialist. And he said this is why he remains a nagging figure in the background of today's Egypt. So which one is he? I think you'll have to make that decision yourself. And I think I don't even know if I can. I want to say he's a little bit of everything. I know he did good things. I know he helped, and I know he hurt. He did so. But I'm not there, and I don't want to make that judgment call on him because I feel like I don't know enough about him. But I know enough to know that, yeah, he definitely is a nagging figure in the history of today's Egypt, and some people for good or for ill. President Anwar al-Sadat, who was one of the young officers, there he is on the right side, standing next to Nasser. And Sadat had been friends with Nasser since 1938. And he was one of the young officers that took part in that 1952 revolution. And Nasser will make him vice president in 1969, just before Nasser dies in 1970. And Sadat will start this corrective revolution. He'll kind of reverse some of the things that Nasser did. He doesn't want the telephones to be bugged by the police anymore. He felt like he initiated civil liberties, did away with the taping telephone calls of dissidents. He had a huge bonfires of secret police tapes. He'll break ties with the USSR. At least he'll begin to. He expelled most of the Soviet technicians. Soviets, they had naval bases, but Sadat will reduce their military from like 20,000 to 1,000. He'll remove their advanced weapons in Egypt, and discreetly he'll begin to solicit buying arms from Western Europe. And then he initiates the Yom Kippur War, Yom Day Kippur to cover. It was the Day of Atonement. It was in the fall. It was a very sacred festival to Jews today, going way back. So on that day is when the Egyptians will attack. And I'll show you this little video clip that kind of gives you an idea what happened in that attack.
At 2 in the afternoon, Egyptian guns open up along the Suez Canal on the forts of the Bar-Lev line. Troops race down the banks and set off in assault boats. In less than an hour, Egypt has 14,000 men across. Pontoon bridges are built. The 500 Israeli troops and the 40 tanks on the Bar-Lev line are overrun or besieged. By 8 the next morning, the Egyptians have 90,000 men and 850 tanks across the canal, and their 5 bridgeheads form an almost continuous line some 5 miles deep into the Sinai.
Well, I'll stop it there, but they became a great threat to Israel, and but the good thing for Egypt is Sadat never intended to take over Egypt, but he did want to get the Sinai Peninsula back from them that he had lost in 1967, and that's what happened. Henry Kissinger will come in and begin his what's called the shuttle diplomacy. He'll be flying back and forth between Egypt and Israel. Nixon will visit Egypt. In fact, he's the first president since Roosevelt, and he'll try to improve Egyptian-American relations by sending aid. And then really Sadat did something unprecedented I want to show you here.
In the winter of 1977, President Anwar al-Sadat made the following announcement. I'm ready to take the peace initiative with me to the whole world, and even to Jerusalem. 10 days following that announcement, Sadat arrived in Israel and became the first Arab leader to conduct an official visit to Israel.
ولقد جئت إليكم اليوم على قدمين ثابتتين لكي نبني حياة جديدة ولكي نقيم السلام وكلنا.
The peace conference was convened in Cairo with the participation of representatives from Egypt, Israel, the U.S., and the UN. March 1979, the signing of the peace treaty at the White House, Washington. In 1982, Israel began to remove all of its presence from the Sinai Peninsula. It almost fully completed this process in 2 years' time.
Let me just talk a little bit about the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty in 1978. So that was in December 1977. 1978 begins the peace treaty in, I want to say, Camp David in the U.S. And Israel did not want, they didn't want to give up the Gaza Strip or the West Bank over the Palestinians. But if Sadat, Carter, and Begin, Menachem Begin, who was the prime minister, if they wanted peace, they would have to have an acceptable plan for the Palestinians. So they finally meet at Camp David in Maryland, the presidential summer retreat, and it'll last for 2 weeks. And it was in the summer, 1978. And there was this appearance of this kind of fraternal feeling among the leaders. It was impressive, but it was misleading. Menachem Begin's personality and insistence, it really irritated Sadat and Carter. They'll say that later. And the Israelis, they'll say, we'll evacuate the Sinai, but we'll only do it in stages. And the two sides they'll continue to negotiate autonomy for the Palestinians. And at one point, Sadat turned his back and said he's done trying to negotiate with Menachem Begin, because Menachem Begin, he was this hard-nosed, wooden-faced, difficult, challenging person to negotiate with. And then President Carter said this interesting thing happened.
The last day was a turning point because we thought we had failed. And we were getting ready to leave Camp David in failure and go back to Washington and announce that we had not been successful. And Prime Minister Begin asked me if I would sign a photograph for his 8 grandchildren of me and Begin and Sadat. And I agreed to do it. And my secretary, whose name was Susan Clow, got the names of Begin's 8 grandchildren from Israel. She called over there and got their names. So instead of saying best wishes, Jimmy Carter, I said with love and best wishes to, and I put down his grandchild's name, and I signed it. And I took it over to his cabin to tell him goodbye. And when he opened the door, he was very angry with me. And he said, "Good afternoon, Mr. President." He was always very proper. And I said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Prime Minister. I'm sorry we hadn't been successful. I brought the photographs you asked for," and I gave the photographs to him. And he turned around and said, "Thank you, sir." And then he looked down at the photographs, and he read out loud, "Love and best wishes to," and he read his grandchild's name. And he put that over in the back, and he read the next one's name. And he read the third one's name, and his chin began to quiver, and tears ran down his cheeks, and mine too. And he said, in effect, "Why don't we try one more time?"
Mm-hmm. Well, Sadat won a Nobel Peace Prize for that, so did Menachem Begin. And he knew the revolutionary societies that he would pay dearly for it, and they were plotting to assassinate him and his wife Jahan. And they didn't like Jahan because they thought she lived too opulent of a style. They were very militant, extremist, conservative Muslims, and they wanted women wearing dresses, headscarves, face veils, gloves. So Sadat would take precautions. He'd change his travel plans, took his private helicopter, wore a bulletproof vest, and then one time on October 6, 1981, on the anniversary of crossing the Suez in the Yom Kippur War, Sadat staged a victory parade, and he sat up on those stands right there on the left. And then as the military artillery tanks went by, and then an artillery armament went by and stopped, and he got up to salute him, and that's when an extremist got off and opened fire on him and others and killed him. He died before he even got to the hospital. Some say he was still alive, but I just read something today that said, yeah, by the time he got there, he was dead. His funeral, it was an impressive array of foreign dignitaries to show how much respect they had for him. It was people like Nixon, Ford, Carter, Prime Minister Begin, Prince Charles. Well, after he dies, Hosni Mubarak, so you can see the 5 presidents here going from right to left, and Hosni Mubarak will take on Sadat's place, and he's an Egyptian military commander turned president as well. He trained as a pilot in the USSR, graduated in Moscow. In spite of his military ties to USSR, Mubarak he'll continue to many of Sadat's policies of cooperation with the United States. But he will distance himself from the United States when we invade Iraq in 2003, because he said, you know, your invasion is going to attract hundreds of bin Ladens, and how true, how prophetic that was. But in the Arab Spring of 2011, because of all the corruption that was in the government and the struggles that people are having, they rise up against him and they'll remove him from power. And then Mohammed Morsi will become the next president, but it won't last very long. He is a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. And a short time after Morsi's election, according to Avi Melamed in his Inside the Middle East, he said that right after the election in June of 2012, an organization of Egyptian young people arose by the name of Zabatak, that literally just means I'm watching you, and they set up this website called the Morsi Meter. And the site would follow the pace of the implementation of the 64 promises he made when before he became the president. And he promised things like pita bread for the transportationists, traffic solutions, improvement of personal safety, security, public order, energy solutions, regarding and supply of gas to homes and more fuel for everybody. And the young people, they eventually granted him 100 days to make good on his promise. And then 1 year later, in 2013, they'll oust him because he failed to deliver his goods. And I should say, you know, one of the mistakes he made was that right away he makes this constitution that would lead to a kind of a more Islamic extreme course with political is kind of combining Islam, the Sharia law, and the politics of Egypt. And this raised some concern and resentment among a lot of the sectors in the Egyptian population, especially among the Christian Copts, which make up a pretty large percentage of Egypt, and women and the young people. Because the constitution that he made was interpreted by Egyptians to be an aggressive attempt by the Muslim Brotherhood to force its hardline ideology on Egypt. Well, Field Marshal al-Sisi he'll execute this military coup d'etat, and took control of the government and dissolved the Islamic Constitution of 2012.
Abdel Fattah el-Sisi rose from a low-level military officer to the leader of the most populous country in the Arab world. Sisi has been the president of Egypt since 2014 after overthrowing the nation's first democratically elected government. And in March, he extended his rule at least another 4 years after the country held an election that critics say was neither free nor fair. Hey guys, I'm Judah with Now This World, and today we're looking back at Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi's rise to power. Sisi was born in 1954 in Cairo, Egypt. He grew up in the Gamaliya neighborhood to a particularly affluent and religiously conservative family. His father, Said el-Sisi, was a shop owner in the local bazaar and was one of the neighborhood's wealthiest men, as well as the biggest employer in the area. Neighbors of the Sisis say that Said was a stern and intimidating figure who always dressed in a suit and tie, unlike most locals. This sternness had a particular effect on young Abdel Fattah. Old friends of the young Sisi said he was incredibly athletic. He would do sets of push-ups in between reading passages of a book and jump up and down stairs so he could build his calf muscles. He also became an extremely disciplined person. Friends even recall that Sisi would punish himself when he felt that he did wrong. Reportedly, he once even shaved his own head after getting in trouble for something his father deemed inappropriate. This drive and intensity laid the foundations for his goal of one day joining the military. Military service in Egypt is required for most men when they come of age. But for Sisi, he didn't want to just join because he had to. Sisi joined because he viewed the army as the best way for him to achieve greatness, something he had dreamed about for some time, literally. In one of his dreams, Sisi recalls telling Anwar Sadat, the former president of Egypt, that one day he'd be president too. In his 20s, Sisi dove into his studies and graduated from the Egyptian Military Academy in 1977, before serving in the infantry. Eventually, he went on to study at military academies in the United Kingdom and the United States. He specialized in military intelligence and began to rise through the ranks. He became a decorated military officer, serving as a military attaché in Saudi Arabia, and then the commander of Egypt's northern military zone under President Hosni Mubarak in 2008. In 2010, he was appointed to become the Director of National Intelligence, which essentially made him the nation's top spy. With this appointment, Sisi became the youngest serving member of an elite governing military body called SCAF, or the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. Everything seemed to be moving along in his favor, but then in 2011, something would happen that would change the course of Egyptian history. It was January 2011 when a civilian uprising dubbed the Arab Spring swept through Egypt. Hundreds of thousands of people flooded into Cairo's Tahrir Square to protest against poverty, unemployment, corruption, and the 3-decade rule of autocratic leader Hosni Mubarak. It was an open secret in Egypt that Mubarak was grooming his younger son, Gamal, to become the nation's next leader. Because the move was unpopular among Egyptian citizens, Sisi knew the day would come when the military would have to part ways with Mubarak. But the Arab Spring made that day come sooner than he originally expected. On February 11th of that same year, the mass demonstrations culminated in the ousting of the longtime ruler, Mubarak. And when Mubarak stepped down, the military stepped in. The move would bring Sisi one step closer to his lifelong dream of being an influential leader. The military institution declared it would run Egypt's government only until an elected civilian government took shape. During this time, Sisi would continue to serve in his role as the nation's spy chief and member of SCAF, which now seemed poised to take control of the country, at least for the short term. SCAF chairman at the time, Hussein Tantawi, became the nation's de facto leader during this transition of power, and Sisi would position himself behind Tantawi as he prepared himself to one day lead the nation. But the elections that the military promised its citizens didn't turn out the way they had hoped. In early 2012, Egypt held parliamentary elections that elected the Muslim Brotherhood, an Islamist political party that had long been at odds with the military. The Brotherhood won a resounding 47% of seats in parliament. This election marked a monumental shift in Egyptian politics where, for the first time, power seemed to be transferring to the Islamists and away from the military. But this wouldn't last too long. In May 2012, Egyptians once again headed to the polls, this time to elect their new president. The frontrunner was Mohamed Morsi, a member of the Brotherhood. But when the Brotherhood's political victory all but seemed certain, the military intervened. 2 days before the final round of the presidential elections, the nation's Supreme Constitutional Court, made up of military-aligned judges, dissolved the Brotherhood-led parliament. The move made one thing clear: elections wouldn't end the long-standing divisions between the military and the Brotherhood, but rather put them on a direct path of confrontation. Morsi went on to win the election, and surprisingly, the military, including Sisi, appeared to accept the results and recognize him as the president-elect.
Now I'm going to stop right there because I realize I am out of time. I'll let you learn more about LCC on your own. I would like to close with this. I would like to say, I want to quote Isaiah chapter 19. There's something special about Egypt. I felt it when I was there. I felt it when I was in the mosque, when I saw those children pray. When those 6 little boys and their dad knelt towards Mecca and prayed, and I could feel their sincerity. And I knew that God was looking over those people and loved those people as much as he loved me. This quote in this scripture in Isaiah, in verse 19, it says, "In that day there shall be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt." Middle of verse 20. "They shall cry unto the Lord because of the oppressors. He shall send them a Savior and a great one, and he shall deliver them. And the Lord shall be known to Egypt. And the Egyptians shall know the Lord in that day, and shall do sacrifice and oblation. Yea, they shall vow a vow unto the Lord and perform it. And the Lord shall smite Egypt, but he shall smite and heal it, and they shall return even to the Lord." I know that God loves those people. I know that he watches over them. And something special is going to happen in the last days before the Savior comes to the earth. They will know the Lord. And I don't know who they is referring to. I don't know if it's just maybe the Christians that are there already, or whether it's many of the people in Islam. But I know that God is aware of them, as he's aware of me and he's aware of you. Don't ever forget that God knows you. I want you to know that I know that God the Father lives, that Jesus is the Christ, our Savior, and that they know you and love you. I bear witness to that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.